Known as the heart of modern China, Shanghai is the nation's largest city with a population of 3.6 million and is also the center of Chinese commerce, industry, finance, and trade. Shanghai had been the center of foreign settlements established by the Western powers for their interests in China. Those settlements were used as the only safety zones in the country, which was in the middle of a civil war. With that as a background, the Chiang Kai-shek Nanking government had used Shanghai as the source of funding to unify the country. However, the government was manipulated by the Western powers, which were alarmed by Japan's economic penetration. Hence, the Nanking government had adopted anti-Japan policies. It breached treaties and agreements signed with Japan and fueled naive citizens' anti-Japan sentiment and mobilized anti-Japan organizations in an attempt to damage the business activities and lives of Japanese residents. This situation led to the outbreak of the North China Incident. The Nanking government started a series of infringements in North China, resulting in the Japanese army to take security and self-defense measures to prevent further expansion of such events. On his way to the international settlement, First Lieutenant Isao Oyama, head of the Japanese Special Naval Landing Forces, was shot to death when his car was suddenly surrounded by members of the Chinese Peace Prevention Corps, who fired several dozen bullets at Oyama. The spot where he was shot was in the demilitarized zone established under the Shanghai ceasefire agreement. This incident was a well-planned act of provocation against uniformed members of the Imperial Japanese Navy. In all areas of Shanghai, Japanese residents, Chinese people, and other foreigners started to evacuate the danger zones immediately after the news spread. In the meantime, the Japanese military was mobilized as an emergency measure to protect Japanese residents and the nation's interests, but with only a small number of soldiers. Their intent was to seek ways for a negotiated settlement. The Japanese military tightened security against Chinese soldiers dozens of times bigger in size. The Chinese military showered machine gun fire against the Japanese military at 10 a.m. on August 13th. Finally, we had no choice but to fire back to defend ourselves. A little past 9 a.m. the following day, Chinese bombers suddenly flew over the headquarters of the Special Navy Landing Forces and launched an airstrike. Then the Chinese started a formation bombing on the Japanese consulate, military ships, and many of our bases. We fired back as well and drove them off. However, all of Shanghai City was thrown into turmoil as the Chinese military planes launched airstrikes even over the city's demilitarized zones. The Chinese military planes also launched a bombing campaign over the entertainment districts in the city, filled with several thousands of Chinese and foreign civilians. It was reportedly said that 940 people were killed and 1,400 others were injured because of this catastrophic bombing. The Japanese military mobilized available resources and started marching toward the capital city of Nanking. The Japanese military courageously fought their way through fierce battlefields, and preparations for an all-out attack on Nanking were completed. In accordance with the spirit of Bushido, our army notified the enemy to surrender. However, no answer was given. Instead, the Chinese military replied to us with gunshots. Finally, an order to launch an all-out attack on Nanking was issued. A task force from the Wakisaka unit succeeded in blowing up the Kwangwo Gate standing before Nanking. Wakisaka unit troops were the first ones to enter the city and proudly put up the flag of the rising sun. The northwest gate to the city, called Yijiang Gate, is known as a place where the greatest tragicomedy took place when the enemy troops retreated. Encircled and attacked by the Japanese troops, the Chinese soldiers were desperately trying to find their way out. They had no choice but to flee to Shakwang from Yijiang Gate. Disoriented, the Chinese soldiers had no other option but to get away from the city walls, because the gate was shut by their fellow soldiers. They made makeshift ropes by tying various things like these to climb down the walls and make a run for their lives. The Chinese soldiers desperately climbed down the walls, took off their military uniforms, and dressed in civilian clothes before running away. With the enemy forces charging from behind and their escape route blocked, with piles of sandbags from inside the gate, the Chinese soldiers lost their way for retreat. It was a losing battle for them in a very miserable manner. Watching those now masterless donkeys, I imagined about Chinese soldiers and their fate as stray sheep. I feel empathy to them. Among brave troops who entered the city, some soldiers bearing honorable wounds were carried on the shoulders of their buddies. Nanking was completely taken over at 1700 p.m. December 13, 1937. Subsequently, a historical ceremony to celebrate Japan's military entrance to Nanking was held on December 17th. The best and brightest members of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy, such as Prince Asaka, Lieutenant General, and General Matsui, top commander, regally marched into the city. It was such a clear and sunny day, with booming sounds of airplanes and joy roaring through the sky. The crowd was given a shout for joy that almost shook the ground. The troops were struck with deep emotions as they held ashes of their buddies who were killed in battle, while contemplating the minds of the brave who attended this honorable ceremony. The headquarters of the 88th Division, which served as the Nanking Defense Force, was used as provisional POW camp. Prisoners had to undergo a close examination for their weapons, bodily features, and use of languages, which indicate if they are soldiers or civilians. There were items such as Czech machine guns and other weapons, as well as Chinese military banners, which were confiscated from Chinese troops. Japanese troops gently treated Chinese prisoners of war. Initially, many Chinese soldiers, disguised as civilians, had slipped into the refugee zone. It was supervised by the International Committee for the Nanking Safety Zone, which comprised of 22 members from foreign countries. These soldiers carried weapons and ammunition, but refugees must have been greatly relieved to be protected by the Japanese military, because the Japanese military was engaged in a mop-up operation for such Chinese soldiers. The refugees made and put up makeshift flags of the rising sun. Some of them made friends with Japanese troops. Look at these people. Look at these children. Needless to say, our brave soldiers did not fight against these people. Construction for an electric cable system was underway. Such work was the top priority in Nanking because of the use of lights was strictly regulated during nighttime hours. More and more residents were returning to their city. Exhausted from the war, they eventually regained their strength and returned home. As an urgent message from Japanese military authorities, posters were put up around the city to encourage residents to register for a certificate. Residents could receive sufficient protection if they had the certificate. A large number of residents reported to register for the certificate. Date of birth, physical appearance, and other information were carried in the certificate. Each of them looked as if they could feel at ease as long as they had the certificate. To make entry exactly in groups of 4 people, they used a stick of bamboo. We Japanese needed to have kadomatsu ornament to celebrate New Year's. Even in the capital city of the foreign country, volunteers from each troop made makeshift kadomatsu and put them up at the gates. However, pine trees for making kadomatsu were hardly found in the city, so they had to go faraway places like Yinjin Mountain to obtain them. It seemed that the ornaments are complete, and they are finally ready for New Year. Then the logistics troops received an ornamented barrel of sake, flattened rice cakes, Mikan oranges, dried squid, kelp, herring roe, miso paste, soy sauce. Tons of New Year delicacies were prepared and served. The Nanking Self-Governing Committee was established on New Year's Day. What's remarkable and admiring here is that even though wounded soldiers were under devoted care of generous Japanese nurses, each and every one of them was aspiring to get well, rejoin his original troop, and return to the front line. Leaving the walled city of Nanking, where were these troops heading to? Their war was not over yet. もちろん戦いはまだ終わったのでありません。